Let's go to the 44th question. We have a passage in the 44th question, passage 4. In India, the authorities always look to store the maximum amount of water in reservoirs during the monsoon season, which is then used for irrigation and generation of electricity during the summer months. It is an internationally accepted practice that the water level of a reservoir should be kept below a certain level before the onset of monsoon season. This is so that when the monsoon rains come, there is a space to store the excess rainwater and also so that the water can be released in a regulated manner. But the authorities store the maximum amount of water in reservoirs even before the close of the monsoon, only to ensure greater electricity generation and irrigation. So what they're saying is that in India, the authorities always store the reservoir with its maximum capacity. So this is not a good practice. This is not an internationally accepted practice because you will always need a buffer space to store. Suddenly, if there are more rains, then you need some space in the reservoir to store the excess water. But the reason why the authorities do it is to use this water for irrigation and generation of electricity. More the water in the reservoir, you can generate more the electricity, and this electricity can be used during the summer months. During the last phase of the monsoon, that would be the last phase when you'll actually have the rains. After that, there will be a dry season. Even before the close of the monsoon, the authorities store the reservoir with the maximum capacity, with the maximum amount of water. Okay, to ensure greater electricity generation, especially during summer and irrigation, and thus violate the internationally accepted practice. Now let's go to the question. 44th question. With reference to the above passage, the following assumptions have been made. Statement 1. High risks involved in holding maximum water in reservoirs are due to our over dependence on hydropower projects. There's nothing in the passage that suggests that we are overly dependent on hydropower projects. They're only talking about not following the international practice, the practice which is recommended for safety to hold water below its maximum capacity in the reservoirs. So statement 1 does not seem to be right, so we'll keep it on hold anyways. Statement 2, storage capacity of dams should not be fully used before or during the monsoon season. This is absolutely true because if you use it fully and if there is a sudden downpour, then there is a high chance of floods because you wouldn't be able to release the water in time. You can't release a large amount of water in time because that itself would cause floods. So you can release water only gradually, and for that the reservoir should not be fully utilized. Statement 3, role of dams in flood control is underestimated in India. We can't really say that the role of dams in flood control because dams do not help in flood control. If you grow trees near the rivers, if you dredge the rivers, then that would result in flood control. But you dams can cause floods because it's an artificial structure. But how could you use dams in flood control? I do not get it. I do not understand that. So I don't think statement 3 is true either. So we'll look at options with the statement 2 in it. So we have three options, A, D and B. Statements 1 and 3 are not conclusive. So I think we can go with option B, that is 2 only. So here we are at passage 5 and 45th question. Economic liberalization in India was shaped largely by the economic problems of the government than by the economic priorities of the people or the long-term development objectives. Thus, there were limitations in conception and design, which have been subsequently validated by experience. Jobless growth, persistent poverty, and rising inequality have mounted as problems since economic liberalization began. And all these years later, four quiet crises confront the economy: agriculture, infrastructure, industrialization, and education as constraints on the country's future prospects. These problems must be resolved if economic growth has to be sustained and transformed into meaningful development. So, let's see what's the crux of the passage. The passage says that economic liberalization in India was shaped largely by the economic problems by the government. What they mean is that what happened in 1991 is that there was a balance of payment crisis. That means we didn't have enough foreign exchange reserves to pay for the imports because our imports were much larger than the exports. And because of this, we had to borrow from the IMF, that is the International Monetary Fund. And the International Monetary Fund would lend us only if we meet certain of their conditions. So this was a forced economic reform on India by the IMF. That's what the author says. He says that there were limitations in the conception and design. Limitations in conception and design. So we couldn't conceive these reforms ourselves or design it ourselves fully. And this has been validated by experience. What was validated? The limitations were validated. The limitations of the reform in India. So how was it validated? Because then we realized that we realize even today that we have a jobless growth, we have persistent poverty even after the reforms, and rising inequality. And all these years later, four quiet crises confront the economy. So he's focusing on four quiet sectors: agriculture, infra, industrialization, and education as major constraints in the country's future prospects. These problems must be resolved if economic growth has to be sustained and transformed into meaningful development. So this, we don't just need development, we also need meaningful development which is sustainable, and the present growth also has to be sustained. So let's go to the question, what he wants in the question. The question he's asking, which of the following is are the most rational and logical inferences that can be made from the passage? What can we infer from the passage? What do we understand from the passage? Statement 1, it says, it is essential to rethink and redefine the economic role of the state in the quest for development. It is essential to rethink and redefine the role of the state, economic role of the state. This you can say is true because if you see the reforms of 1991, as I said, it was thrust upon us. So we actually need a thinking space. Our government needs a thinking space to think what is actually good for India and what would serve its long-term objectives, long-term development objectives. So redefining the economic role of the state is somewhere implied in the passage by the author. So we'll go with it. Let's go to the second statement. India has not made effective implementation of its policies in social sectors, nor made sufficient investments in them. We can't say that we haven't made sufficient investments in social sectors. We also can't say that we have not made effective implementation of our policies in social sectors. See, the author is talking about economic liberalization, which was not fully on our own volition. His thrust is on that. And secondly, his emphasis is on agriculture, infrastructure, industrialization, and education. Okay, he says that these are the crises. So he mostly recommends us to have a different kind of an economic role, a different kind of designing of the policies which suits our needs. He or she doesn't talk about our investment in social sector or the effective implementation of our policies in the social sector. Option A would be the right answer. The 46th question, we have the same passage. So let's go to the question directly. 46. With reference to the above passage, the following assumptions have been made. Let's go to the statements. 1. India's economy needs to be greatly integrated within global economy, greatly integrated with the global economy. Why this word greatly? So as to create large number of jobs and to sustain its growth momentum. No, that's not what the author says. He talks about the kind of reforms which we have introduced in our country. He's not talking about integration or disintegration with the global economy. He's not recommending anything, he or she, to be gender sensitive. In statement 2, it should be economic. Economic liberalization would cause large economic growth, which would reduce poverty and create sufficient employment in the long run. No, the author doesn't imply this as well. He just says that there needs to be a right kind of an economic liberalization and not just economic liberalization. He already gives us an instance. He says that it has been validated by experience that India's economic liberalization did not prove to be fruitful to us. So, economic liberalization in all instances would cause large economic growth, which would reduce poverty. No, it wouldn't. And India is an example for that, according to the author. So, neither one nor two is right. So, option D should be the right answer. Let's go to the 61st question. And we have a passage 1. Bank credit to the industrial sector has started shrinking. What has shrunk? The credit has shrunk. Its decline has been a serious concern as credit growth is essential to revive investment. So why is credit important? So I take credit from bank, that is I take loan from bank, and then I start a business and I generate employment, and thus the economy grows. Okay, so credit is not a bad thing when you see the larger picture. So when there's a decline in credit, it comes out as a serious concern to the economy. The problem's origins lie in the incomplete reforms of the last 25 years. So they say that the reforms of 1991 have been incomplete. An institutional change that should have followed the 1991 reforms should have been setting up of a resolution corporation for banks. So if the banks fail, if the banks give large amount of loans to huge industries, and these industries are not able to perform in a depression, in a bad economic condition like the present day coronavirus situation, then they wouldn't be able to repay back their loans that they have taken from the banks. And in such situation, the banks collapse. So we need the setting up of a resolution corporation for banks to take over these banks so that the banks can exit. So institutional change that should have followed the 1991 reforms means that after the reforms were introduced, there needs to be some kind of institutions set up to supplement the reforms, to strengthen the reforms, to ensure that the reforms are working. In a market economy with booms and busts, banks should be allowed to set up and to fail. So that's what they say. Like in a market economy, there are booms and busts, there are periods of highs and lows. So the bank should be allowed to set up and also to fail. Failure is natural. Failure is normal for banks in an economy. Today we cannot shut down banks because there is no proper system to shut them down. They just keep dragging. Even if they're not profit making, they just keep dragging and they're present in the economy. There is no proper system to shut them down. Weak loss making banks continue to need more capital. They're always in need of capital, more and more capital. So the author here seems to be recommending a resolution corporation which can buy out these bad banks, and rather than the weak loss making banks trying to revive itself by using more capital. Let's go to the question. Question number 61. Which one of the following is the most logical and rational inference that can be made from the above passage? Let's go through the options. Option A, Indian banking system is not able to help the country in its economic growth. This is an extreme statement to make. Is not able to help the country. No, Indian banking system is able to help the country, but there are things of concern, there are points of concern like the credit growth has shrunk, and this is a concern. But they are nowhere, the author is nowhere saying that Indian banking system is not able to help the country in its economic growth. Option B, economic reforms that started in 1991 have not helped in improving the economy to the expected levels. The author does say that the reforms have been incomplete. If you see over here, he says that incomplete reforms of the last 25 years. And that's where the problem's origin lies, the problem of shrinking of credit growth, problem of shrinking of bank credit to the industrial sector. So let's keep this option on hold. Option C, India lacks the institutional mechanism to deal with the failure of banks. This can be the right option because this emphasis is on the institutional mechanism that supports the reforms, especially when the banks fail. He says that the failure of banks is very natural to economy because the economy experiences booms and busts. And during the bust period, there needs to be an institutional mechanism which supports the reforms, economic reforms. And these economic reforms, sorry, and these institutional mechanisms are what makes the economic reforms complete. So option C seems to be very appropriate, but we'll go to the option D as well. Encouraging the foreign investments in our industrial sector is a good alternative to this sector's dependence on banks for credit. No, the author doesn't talk about foreign investments anywhere and does not imply it as well. So we would go with option C. Let's go to the 62nd question. India has tremendous potential for solar energy. We all realize that we have to stop burning fossil fuels to meet our energy needs. But certain renewable resources are still going through their cost curves and learning curves to get the required amount of output. The Indian government has strongly committed to its targets of reducing emissions by 33% by 2030. And towards this, it has initiated a strong push towards a gas-based economy and has also invested heavily in renewable energy. However, business houses are wary of investing too heavily in renewable energy at a time when the technology is not yet ready. So what they're saying is that India has a tremendous potential for solar energy. That's okay. Solar energy is one of the renewable energy. They're talking about it. We all realize that we have to stop burning fossil fuels. That's also true. We have to stop burning fossil fuels because fossil fuels result in a lot of air pollution, carbon compounds, volatile organic compounds, monoxide, and everything else, sulfur and whatnot, to meet our energy needs. But certain renewable resources are still going through their cost curves. Renewable resources are going through their cost curves and learning curves. Learning curves in the sense we are inventing new and newer technology by each passing year. We are learning how could we extract the renewable resource into usable forms. Cost curve in the sense presently if you see the cost of using renewable energy, it is too high. So we want this to be reduced because only then it would be feasible for the common man. The common man would be able to afford this technology. The Indian government has strongly committed to its targets of reducing emissions by 33%. So Indian government has committed to reducing emissions by 33% by 2030. This is true. And towards this, it has initiated a strong push towards a gas-based economy. So we are focusing on a gas-based economy, which is less polluting, and has also invested heavily in renewable energy. However, business houses are wary of investing too heavily in renewable energy. If the business houses invest a lot and then they realize that people are not buying things from them, Their products are not marketable. That is, if the cost of renewable energy is too high, then it is not a good business prospect. Then it doesn't make good business sense to invest in renewable energy when the technology is not yet ready. So what the passage says is that we are in the initial stages of implementation of renewable energy in our day-to-day lives. So let's go to the question. The question asks, which one of the following is the most logical and rational inference? What could you infer that can be made from the above passage? Option A, India's commitment to reduce emissions by 33% is unlikely to be achieved. Very negative statement to make. So most probably this is not the right answer, but we'll keep it on hold. India should import gas rather than invest in renewable resources. No, the passage doesn't say that we need to import gas rather than invest in renewable resources. No, he doesn't talk about that. He just says that the renewable resources are not ready yet to be delivered in the present day market at an affordable cost to the consumers. So this is a wrong option. Let's go to option C. Getting renewable resources to market too soon may be costly. Yes, this is true because the technology is not ready yet. The technology is not ready yet, and people are still wary of investing in it. There's a lot of research to be done. There's a learning curve which is going on, the cost curve which is evolving. So we'll keep it on hold. It seems to make sense though. Let's see option D. India should put in more efforts in the exploration of natural gas. The author doesn't talk about exploration of natural gas and that India is not making enough efforts. He doesn't convey this anywhere. So I would just eliminate this. Option C seems to be the most closest to the answer. Getting renewable resources to market too soon may be costly. Although it's something good, although it's something appreciable, but it may be costly. Okay, we are in the 63rd question, passage 2. It's the same passage. So let's go to the 63rd question. The passage is same as the previous question. With reference to the above passage, the following assumptions have been made. Governments often provide inefficient and costly subsidies for technologies that may not be ready in the near future. Well, the author does say that the technology is not ready in the near future. That's true. But we cannot say that the subsidy is inefficient. I have a problem with this word inefficient. Just because it's not ready today, just because we are not able to see the fruits of the technology today, the effort that we put in today cannot be termed as inefficient. And similar language is used while the author talks about costly subsidies. The cost of what we bear today, the investment, the returns to this investment may take time, but we can't really call it as a costly subsidy. So, seeing the negative tone of this statement, I would eliminate it. And let's go to the second statement. India's commitment of reducing emissions by 33% by 2030 shall be on the basis of gas-based economy. Okay, so shall be on the basis of gas-based economy, it's true. Shall be only on the basis of gas-based economy is false. But here they're given only shall be on the basis of gas-based economy. So this statement seems to be true. Let's go to the passage how they talk about gas-based economy. From here, the Indian government has strongly committed to its targets of reducing emissions by 33% by 2030, and towards this it has initiated a strong push towards a gas-based economy and also invested heavily in renewable energy. So both are of equal importance, gas-based energy and renewable energy. So option 2 is not wrong per se because gas-based economy is also playing an important part, but it is not the only thing on the basis of which our commitment to reduce emissions have been made. So I'll go with option B to be the right answer, 2 only. See, these passage kind of questions, these English questions are mostly perception based questions. There are certain passages which you can clearly say that this is the right answer, but in certain of the passages, you can never make out what UPSC thinks. So it's okay to not get the right answer. You can't be right all the time. Let's see the passage 3 for the 64th question. Genome editing is different from genome modification. Genome editing typically involves finding the part of plant genome that could be changed to render it less vulnerable to disease or resistant to certain herbicides or to increase yields. Researchers use molecular scissors to dissect the genome and repair it, which is a process that occurs naturally when plants are under attack from diseases and can throw up new mutations that enable the plant to survive future attacks. This evolutionary process can effectively be speeded up now that it is possible to examine plant genomes in detail in laboratories and create mechanisms through which the relevant genes can be altered very precisely. Let's have a relook at the passage before we go to the questions. Always we need to read the passage twice. Probably you should not do it thrice because you may be short of time at times. I mean, especially if you take a long time to work out the maths part. It's not really maths part, it's aptitude part. So anyways, 2 times is a must. So we are going for the second time. Genome editing is different from genome modification, he says. But as you can see, he doesn't talk much about genome modification. He talks about genome editing and what it is. Genome editing typically involves finding the part of a plant genome that could be changed to render it less vulnerable to disease. So you know what a gene is, right? A gene is a part of a chromosome which in turn contains DNA, which in turn contains nitrogen phosphate base pairs. These are, for example, adenosine, thymine, guanine, cytosine. So the way these 4 basic base pairs are arranged determines what your gene is. A gene is basically the ordering of DNA, ordering of the base pairs in the DNA. So if you see, what they do is they pluck out a certain part of your chromosome, of your gene, of the particular order and change the order to some other order. And this would make the plant less vulnerable to disease. As they say here, less vulnerable to disease or resistant to certain herbicides, or it increases the yields. Researchers use molecular scissors. You need a scissor to cut out these base pairs. It's not like the scissors we use in our daily life. There is certain kind of a chemical combination they use to dissect the genome and repair it. So they will replace it with some other gene. This is a process that occurs naturally. This is not something we have invented. We have discovered it and we have tried to create it in our labs, tried to reproduce it in our labs. So this process happens when plants are under attack from diseases and can throw up new mutation. What we are talking about now is also mutation that enable the plant to survive future attacks so that this species of plant does not get extinct from nature. This evolutionary process can effectively be speeded up now that it is possible to examine plant genomes in detail in laboratories and create mechanisms through which the relevant genes can be altered very precisely. This is important. Now we have the technology that CRISPRs, I don't know how they pronounce it, CRISPR and other technologies through which you can reach the specific genome and you can edit that particular gene in a very precise manner. Let's go to the question. 64th question, he asks, with reference to the above passage, the following assumptions have been made. Statement 1. So let's go to statement 1. It says genome editing does not require the transfer of genes from one plant to another. Well, actually, if you go to the base, then every DNA, whether it's my DNA or a banana's DNA, It's all made up of ATCG, adenosine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. These are base pairs which occur together, like A with T and C with, and if there's a C, then it will pair with G. So we call it as base pair. So this is same for all animals. So all animals, plants, and most of the living organisms. So when you transfer a gene to a plant, it can be from an animal as well. So genome editing does not require the transfer of genes from one plant to another. You can do it from an animal as well. So this is the right statement. Statement 2. Through genome editing, the chosen genes can be altered very precisely in a manner akin to the natural process that helps plants to adapt to the environmental factors. This is true. This is what the passage is talking about. Let's have a look at the passage. They say that and repair it, which is a process that occurs naturally when plants are under attack from diseases. So this is what they're talking about. So option statement 2 is the right statement. I will go with option C, both 1 and 2, which is the right answer. Going to passage 4, 65th question. Many people understand the connection between solid waste management and health in terms of the consequences of unattended heaps of dry garbage which become home for flies and other vermin. However, there is another aspect that is not well understood. That is, what happens when unscientific solid waste management combines with poor drainage and dumping of untreated sewage into drains, which are meant to carry storm water during rains. The result is choked drains which are full of stagnant water-breeding mosquitoes, resulting in the spread of waterborne diseases. Let's read the passage again. Many people understand the connection between solid waste management and health in terms of the consequences of unattended heaps of dry garbage which become home for flies and other vermin. So what happens is when we see this solid waste management, we see it in terms of this dry garbage, and we see those flies and other insects which surround this dry garbage. The author says, however, there is another aspect that is not well understood. That is, what happens when unscientific solid waste management combines with poor drainage. He's talking about this combination. And dumping of untreated sewage into drains, which are meant to carry storm water during rains. The result is choked drains, which are full of stagnant water breeding mosquitoes, resulting in the spread of waterborne diseases. So here the author, he talks about mixing of this solid waste with the water that flows in the drains, in the storm water drains. Storm water drains are meant to carry rainwater, and when this solid waste gets choked in the pipes, in the drains, the water becomes stagnant and the mosquitoes and other vermin can breed, and there is a likelihood of spread of waterborne diseases. Let's go to the question. In the context of India, which one of the following statements best reflects the critical message of the passage? Option A, in India, the drainage networks are not separate for sewerage and storm water. He doesn't say that anywhere. He doesn't say that the drainage networks are not separate. In fact, he seems to be indicating that it is separate. So this doesn't seem to be the right statement, but we'll keep it on hold. Statement B, option B, urban local bodies do not have enough resources and legislative authority to deal with the problems of waste management. Do not have enough resources and legislative authority. We can't say this is true. We can say that the solid waste is not well managed. That is true. But you don't have enough resources or authority. Can't really say that. We'll keep this option on hold. Option C, solid waste management should be integrated with the maintenance of drainage and sewerage networks. This is true. The process with which you manage solid waste should be linked with the way you maintain your drainage and sewerage networks. This is true, and this is the crux of the passage. Option D, bad management of solid waste and sewerage systems by our municipalities is the reason for drinking water shortages in our cities. They don't talk about drinking water shortages at all. They're talking about diseases, the spread of waterborne diseases. So option C is the right option. In Part 3 of the Constitution, which assures people certain fundamental rights, Article 25 proclaims that all persons are equally entitled to freedom of conscience and the right freely to profess, practice, and propagate religion. What people fail to notice is that this proclamation is prefixed with the words subject to public order, morality, health, and to the other provisions of this part, that is the third part, part 3 of the Constitution, which sets conditions precedent for the legal protection of religious practices of any community. The closing words of this prefatory rider in Article 25 virtually constitute a subordination clause placing other fundamental rights mentioned in Part 3 over and above the right to religious freedom. Among those other fundamental rights is the right to equality before law and equal protection of laws, assured at the outset and elaborated in later articles to mean, inter alia, that the state shall not deny equal protection of laws to any person or group of persons on the basis of religion alone. Guys, let's read the passage again. In part 3 of the Constitution, assures people certain fundamental rights, that's okay. And Article 25 proclaims that all persons are equally entitled to the freedom of conscience and the right to freely profess, practice, and propagate religion. So you can practice whatever religion you want, propagate the religion, profess that you are practicing that particular religion, and you have the freedom of conscience. What people fail to notice is that this proclamation is prefixed with the words subject to public order, morality, health, and to other provisions of this part. That means you can practice your religion as you like, but it's subject to public order. That you can't go around rioting. Say your religion asks you to riot. It's just a hypothetical example. You can't do it as per the constitution because it would affect the public order. And say there is some kind of obscenity in your religion. Tomorrow you start a new religion and there's all obscenity. Then you can't practice that because it would affect the morality. Or if you indulge in unsanitary practices because it's a part of your religion, then it would affect the health. There are conditions which are precedent to the legal protection of religious practices of any community. The closing words of the prefatory rider in Article 25 virtually constitute a subordination clause. So your right to practice your religion is subordinate to the other fundamental rights mentioned in Part 3. So they are over and above the right to religious freedom. Among those other fundamental rights is the right to equality. Right to equality before law and equal protection of the laws. That is Article 14. Assured at the outset and elaborated in later articles. That is, it is outset in the sense it's mentioned briefly in Article 25 and it is also elaborated in the later articles to mean inter alia that the state shall not deny equal protection of laws to any person or group of persons on the basis of religion alone. Just because you belong to a particular religion which does not stand for equality, that doesn't mean that you wouldn't get the protection of that, doesn't mean that you wouldn't be treated equally in front of the law, which is told by Article 14. So let's go to the question. 66 question asks, what is the most logical inference from the above passage? Statement A, state shall not interfere with the religious affairs of the citizens. This is true to some level. Let's keep it on hold. Shall not interfere, subject to certain conditions. Statement B, religious freedom under the Constitution is open to state intervention. This is true, but we'll again keep it on hold. Option C, religious freedom of the citizens is not covered under fundamental rights. It's wrong because the passage clearly says that it's covered under Article 25. Option D, religious practices of any community are immune to state laws. This is totally wrong. In fact, the state laws apply on the community. The right to practice your religion is subject to conditions, so your state laws do apply on your right to practice your religion freely. So option B is the right answer. Religious freedom under the Constitution is open to state intervention.